All right, hello everyone. I want to talk about an important topic today. It's not a very funny topic. I try to be funny, but this is not funny. Okay. So, what is a political prisoner? Political prisoner, by definition, is a person imprisoned for their political beliefs or action. Now, when someone in America hears about a political prisoner, they might think of Cuba or the Middle East, or some other country, not the U.S. Rarely would it cross an American's mind that there are political prisoners right here in this country. But there are. As I speak these words, in 2021, as of now, we have hundreds of victims of political imprisonment right here in the United States of America, most of them being right wing. And that's only the ones I was able to find. There could be much more, but I just don't know. So, how did this happen? There's a cause. There's a reason why this happened. There's a reason why, even during the Trump administration, these injustices were happening. And I'm going to tell you about some of the anecdotal cases here. But yeah, during the Trump administration, we had a justice system that was incredibly biased against right-wing offenders, and that in many cases gave leniency towards left-wing offenders. So how did this happen? Well, the makeup of prosecutors in the U.S. have changed over the last few years, thanks to tireless efforts from leftist mega donors such as George Soros to install radical leftist district attorneys throughout the United States. These radical DAs have nullified laws against Antifa protesters by failing to enforce them. Meanwhile, taking every opportunity to impose swift punishment upon right-wingers, even for the smallest of infractions. In Portland, Oregon, left-wing violence now seems to be a way of life. We had the rioting there, and we've had months and months of ongoing protests in Portland. Well, Soros funneled funds to Mike Schmidt's district attorney campaign. Now, Mike Schmidt is a leftist radical. Mike Schmidt announced before he won the election that he would not prosecute any of the leftist rioters responsible for the $1 billion in damage to the city done over months and months. He kept true to his word. When he was elected, he dropped charges for almost everyone who was arrested in Portland for those violent riots. Now, Soros's funneling of campaign funds to radical left DAs did not stop in Portland. Soros has spent more than $13 million in district attorney races in 17 states over the past few years. Radical left DAs have been installed in California, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. In 2017, Soros spent roughly $1.7 million on electing just one single DA, and that was Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. Unsurprisingly, Krasner presided over a dramatic rise in crime. Soros has done the same in Los Angeles, funding radical leftist DA George Gascon, who has since told a murder victim's family to keep their mouth shut. Now, when you examine the differences in the outcomes of the leftist riots of 2020 and the Capitol riot on January 6th, you see a lack of accountability for crimes committed by leftists and a pattern of cruel and unusual punishments being imposed upon conservatives. When examining the facts that none of the Antifa criminals in Portland were held accountable for their crimes, meanwhile, conservatives who protested for a few hours out of a single day are still being held in jail right now, months after the fact, many with no charge. Okay, this is proof that the U.S. holds political prisoners, and we should all be ashamed, not just as conservatives, but as Americans. Now, during the so-called peaceful George Floyd protests, a conservative man named Aaron Danielson was murdered in cold blood by Antifa filth Michael Reynal. Minutes after, just feet away from where he was murdered, another piece of left-wing garbage, shouted proudly through a megaphone, "I'm not sad that a fascist is dead." The response was a resounding roar of approval from the crowd of radical leftists. Now let's do a little role reversal, okay? If the roles had been reversed and a conservative shot leftist Michael Raynal, right-wing protesters within a 50-mile radius would be terrified of leftist retribution. There would be no standing in the streets feet away from where the crime was committed, shouting in a megaphone how happy they were that a communist is dead. Okay? Because everyone, every conservative, not even just conservative protesters, every conservative in that town, every conservative public figure would be terrified of leftist retribution, of leftist revenge. Once the killer were found, he would be handed swift indictments along with everyone who was with him on the day. Everyone who protested with the right-wing murderer would be handed conspiracy charges, facing decades in prison, their lives ruined. Right-wing groups who had nothing to do with the murder would be in shambles after being targeted by leftists and their members being doxxed. Small groups of conservatives would have to disband because they would be ill-equipped to deal with the leftist blowback. Now, this role-reversing scenario I just put forward is tame considering the cruel and unusual punishment that conservatives have faced just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once a right-winger is marked by the left, the target on their back sticks like a permanent tattoo. If you have not heard the stories of Christopher Cantwell, Maxwell Hare, and John Kinsman, that's not surprising. These cases went largely underreported. The very few media accounts of these cases are tainted by yellow journalism. To become aware of the objective facts behind these cases, one must dig, and I did just that. When one hears the full account of events, it becomes apparent beyond any doubt that conservative political prisoners are a common occurrence in the United States. Now, let me tell you the story of Christopher Cantwell. Christopher Cantwell is an interesting fella, to say the least. This is a guy who had a seemingly normal childhood. He was raised by his mom and dad. They were pretty wealthy, pretty well off. But nonetheless, he started to develop troubling behavior in his late teens. He dropped out of high school. At age 20, he served his first prison sentence for weapons charges and driving under the influence. By age 29, he would be, in his own words, radicalized to libertarianism after listening to a presentation by a libertarian gentleman named Michael Badnarik. Now, that very year, he announced he'd be running for a seat in the House of Representatives, but he didn't collect enough signatures to get on the ballot. Christopher Cantwell held strong anti-police views, going so far as to advocate for violence against police officers. In 2012, Cantwell moved to New Hampshire, where he would join the libertarian group Free State Project, only to be kicked out for his extreme positions. So Chris Cantwell was rejected by libertarians for being too extreme, which led him to start associating with the far right. It was around this time that he started Radical Agenda. This was his call-in podcast where he would talk to other people about his ideologies. Now, fast forward to August 12, 2017. It was on this day that Chris Cantwell woke up in the morning knowing he was going to do an interview for Vice and attend the Unite the Right rally, a rally that would become infamous later on for the wrong reasons, or for the reasons that the organizers did not intend. Now, when Chris Cantwell woke up on the morning of August 12, 2017, he did not know that the forthcoming events would have devastating and potentially lifelong consequences. What he didn't know was, from that day forward, he would forever be a marked man. So here's how that day went. In the morning, Chris Cantwell sat down for an interview with journalist Elle Reeve. Topics of discussion were his principles, his thought about then-President Donald Trump, and this interview ended up going viral, essentially overnight. It was arguably this interview that made him a marked man. People were angry, and they were looking for someone to blame, for the rally. And Christopher Cantwell became one of the faces of the rally because of the interview he did with Vice. If he had not agreed to do that interview and just kind of blended in and was just kind of one of the attendees, likely he would not have ended up a marked man, and it's very likely that his attendance at this rally would not have altered his life forever. But we will get to that. Let's get to what else happened at this rally. So later on, after the interview, after Chris Cantwell's interview with Vice, he was at the rally. Now, during this rally, there were counter-protesters, Antifa, essentially. And these counter-protesters began to face off with the rally attendees, the alt-right, we'll call them, of which Christopher Cantwell was among, obviously. Now, the leftist counter-protesters outnumbered the rally attendees 2-1. Okay, now, I have reviewed all of the video I could find of this rally, and from what I see, and I've seen many videos of the alt-right marching, and what I saw in every video was that Antifa started the violence. Okay, there's videos of these guys marching peacefully and then Antifa going in and punching and kicking them. There were also reports of Antifa people throwing their own urine and feces at people, as well as water balloons filled with pink paint. Now, in this confusion, in this disarray of 1,500 people in total clashing against each other, Christopher Cantwell was pepper sprayed by a member of Antifa. This is actually shown in the now viral Vice documentary. Now, at some other point, Cantwell also pepper sprayed a counter-protester. Now, these occurrences, these pepper sprayings were not unique during the face-off. It's estimated that hundreds of demonstrators on both sides were carrying pepper spray, and there were several incidences of people being hit with pepper spray on both sides. After the rally was all said and done, and the infamy of Christopher Cantwell from being on the Vice documentary, after all this was settling, after all this was ensuing, Christopher Cantwell was brought up on serious charges, okay? Those charges were 2 counts of the illegal use of tear gas and 1 count of malicious bodily injury with a caustic substance. The charges against Cantwell were serious. He was facing 40 years in prison for pepper spraying someone. I want you to let that sink in. Now, none of the other people carrying pepper spray and pepper spraying others at the rally were charged. Christopher Cantwell was the only one charged for pepper spraying someone. And let's go over these charges. These were all felonies, as I just said. And Christopher Cantwell was facing 40 years in prison if found guilty on these charges. And as I said, no one else was charged with pepper spraying. But listen to this. This is even more outraging. Let's just listen to this. There was a KKK member at the same rally who fired a pistol at a black counter-protester. So quite literally by the definition, this is a hate crime. Okay. Now he didn't hit the black counter-protester, but he did fire at him. Okay. Now he pled guilty to, I forget what the charge was, but, I believe they made some kind of a plea deal. He was sentenced to just 4 years. Okay? Now, how is it that Christopher Cantwell, in the same jurisdiction, was facing 4 decades, 10 times longer, for an infraction far less severe? One was a KKK leader who shot a gun at a black person and luckily didn't hit him. And the other was Christopher Cantwell pepper spraying someone who was attacking his group. Why is this? Well, okay, the answer is pretty clear. The obvious answer is that the KKK leader wasn't featured in a viral documentary and Chris Cantwell was. But is that how our justice system should work? Should someone be facing 40 years in prison for an infraction that most people would get a slap on the wrist for simply because they appeared in a viral documentary? My answer to that is of course not, but I'll let you, the viewer, be the judge of that. So in July 2018, Christopher Cantwell agreed to a plea bargain. He got time served and was able to leave the courtroom a free man and go back to his home in New Hampshire. He was unable to leave the state of Virginia for nearly a year. Now, this was a huge weight lifted off his shoulder. He was no longer facing 4 decades in prison, but his nightmare was far from over. Cantwell left the courtroom, absolved of all charges, but in the court of the radical left, he had a life sentence. He was now a marked man. The radical left already went to great lengths to throw the book at him, and they were not through. He probably knew to some extent that he had a target on his back, but I don't think he understood the gravity of the situation he was in. He spent the remainder of 2018 and 2019 building up his show and website. Cantwell developed a short-lived friendship with the alt-right group Bull Patrol. The relationship pretty soon became adversarial. He became a target of prank calls to his podcast, fake accounts pretending to be him, and music videos making fun of him. In return, Cantwell made violent threats towards the group and contacted the FBI about pranks perpetrated by Bull Patrol members. It is alleged that Cantwell emailed law enforcement more than 50 times over a 4-month period in 2019. In June 2019, Cantwell threatened a member of the Bull Patrol, saying he would rape his wife in front of his children and contact CPS about his alleged drug use if he did not provide Cantwell with the information on the identity of a Bull Patrol member operating under a pseudonym. The pseudonym was Vic Mackey. Now, I couldn't find the transcript of the entire conversation where Chris Cantwell made this threat. The only line of the whole exchange was the one that he was charged for. So I'm going to read that here. This is what Chris Cantwell said to this other Bull Patrol member. He said, "So if you don't want me to come and fuck your wife in front of your kids, then you should make yourself scarce. Give me Vic. It's your only out." It was those 32 words sent over 6 months earlier that enabled the FBI to come to Chris Cantwell's residence and place him under arrest. He was charged with 2 federal charges, and those were transmitting interstate extortionate communications and threatening to injure property and reputation. After 4 days of testimony, Cantwell was convicted of both charges. He was sentenced to 41 months in prison. So he's now sitting in federal prison for sending a fucked up text message that probably didn't have much credibility. Now, let me make this abundantly clear. No one should ever threaten to rape someone's wife in front of their kids. There's no scenario in which that is okay. But let me just put this out there. Are these types of texts rare? Absolutely not. In fact, many of the people who have fallen victim to cancel culture report receiving texts just like the ones Cantwell sent. Reported incidents describe hateful messages inundated with death and rape threats, and some of them excruciatingly detailed and aimed at that person and their family member. Okay, some of the people who received these kinds of threats were Roseanne Barr, Tucker Carlson, Caroline Flack, Ben Shapiro. Every one of these individuals I just mentioned received serious threats from online trolls, much like the one Cantwell sent. Caroline Flack received messages so brutally horrific that she took her own life. Now, Caroline Flack was the only one of all those people who was not in America, but I mentioned her because she ended up committing suicide as a result. And none of these people were hit with any charges. Okay, the FBI has yet to charge a single individual for the threats sent to these people. Now, why would that be? The reason is clear. The FBI isn't interested in prosecuting interstate threats, not unless the perpetrator is someone with unpopular far-right views like Cantwell. The FBI doesn't care about people making online threats to people in other states. Okay, that's not a top priority for them. What is a top priority is getting a marked man, getting Christopher Cantwell. The FBI wanted to send a message. They wanted to send a message saying, if you are someone like Christopher Cantwell, you better tread lightly because we're going to get you one day or another, sooner or later. No one sits in a federal prison for sending a fucked up text message. I'd be surprised if someone could find me 20 cases where somebody sent a fucked up text message and then were brought up on federal charges. This never happens. Now let's talk about Maxwell Hare and Jonathan Kinsman of the Proud Boys. In October 2018, Gavin McInnes was giving a speech at the Metro Republican Club. Now, at that point, McInnes was the leader of the Proud Boys. He also founded the group. The group has been unfairly characterized by the mainstream media as a neo-fascist organization. Now, this accusation is completely and categorically false, but despite the inaccuracy of this description, the group is widely and unquestionably seen as such by most people, less the well-informed and well-researched. But I digress. During this speech that Gavin McInnes was giving, Antifa protesters gathered outside and they were prowling for trouble. They vandalized the building and they waited for the Proud Boys to come outside. When a group of Proud Boys did come outside, Hare and Kinsman were among them. Okay, so they exited the building, and what did Antifa do? Antifa threw a water bottle at the group. Now, this started a fight. Now, it was this incident, it was this fight that inspired radical leftist DA Cyrus Vance to bring gang charges against Maxwell Hare and Jonathan Kinsman. Now, this is surprising. Normally, when two opposing groups of people get into a fight, usually there would not be charges at all. But if there was going to be charges, they would be to the tune of misdemeanor simple assault charges. The victims in this criminal complaint, which were Antifa, they refused to cooperate with authorities. This by itself usually would be enough to drop the charges completely and not go forward with the prosecution. This happened in Manhattan. Their legal system is already completely overwhelmed. The fact that a fight between two opposing groups would be prosecuted at all is completely unusual. Proud Boys is not a gang. It's a men's club. And this was a simple fight that was provoked. Okay, an object was thrown at them. But regardless, these were the charges that were brought. Hare and Kinsman had no prior criminal records. But regardless, they were indicted. The case was brought to trial, and a jury was convinced that these men were guilty of gang assault. They were sentenced to 4 years in prison for what most people would have been given community service for, if anything at all. So it's very tragic. And this is proof that conservatives are treated extremely unfairly. Here you got a bunch of Antifa who carelessly caused $1 billion in property damage, who murdered a conservative man named Aaron Danielson and faced no criminal liability. You know, these two conservative men had a water bottle thrown at them, and now they're sitting in prison. That would have never happened to a leftist. In addition to the district attorney wanting to crucify Hare and Kinsman for their political beliefs, the judge also seemed to be very similarly motivated. At the sentencing, this is what the judge said, and I quote, "It's a shame when some people jump up and down on a platform and their followers and their soldiers get in trouble." These words were a direct reference to Gavin McInnes, okay? Only thing is, Gavin McInnes wasn't on trial. Hare and Kinsman were on trial. But to this judge, this was Gavin McInnes on trial. And I'm sure many others felt that way. I'm sure the prosecutor presented to the jury as if this was Gavin McInnes on trial and not two men who were independent of Gavin McInnes. The judge also compared Herr and Kinsman's actions to Nazi Germany when he said this: I know enough about history to know what happened in Europe in the late 30s when political street brawls were allowed to go ahead. We don't want that to happen in New York. So it's clear that the judge and prosecutor wanted to send a political message, and the message has been received. Okay, the message has been received loud and clear. Conservatives are routinely handed down swift charges and cruel sentences simply because they are conservative. The media blackouts on the cases of Christopher Cantwell, the Proud Boys, and the 500 Capitol riot arrests show that the mainstream media does not want the truth getting out. They push the narrative that in these cases we are dealing with neo-Nazi far-right domestic terrorists, and that is all we need to know. But the truth is far more sinister. Antifa acts as the de facto paramilitary wing of the Democrat Party, and hence can cause $1 billion worth of damage upon once great American cities and receive no punishment. They can murder great patriots like Aaron Danielson, cheer minutes after, and receive no pushback. Meanwhile, Christopher Cantwell discharges a can of pepper spray upon an assailant who was in the process of attacking him, and he faces 4 decades in prison as a result. Meanwhile, Antifa scum start a fight with Proud Boys, and they are given 4 years in prison and compared to Nazi Germany. These cases are the smoking gun. In the United States, conservatives are given unfair trials and imprisoned for no other reason than their political alignment. In the greatest country in the world, conservative individuals risk falling victim to political imprisonment every day. We cannot let the radical left keep these stories buried. We need to let the truth be known. The more we expose the radical left, the more capable we become of stopping them, and we have to stop them. We cannot let this to continue.